Empire of Blood. Episode 5. War is won before it begins. Ögedei Khan, the Mongol Empire. 1229 to 1241. A production of Empire of Blood. The smell reaches the Mongol lines before the walls do. Kaifeng, in the autumn of 1232, smells of burning wood, of unwashed thousands, of the particular sweetness that has no name in any language except the language of those who have lived through siege warfare. The smell of a city consuming itself. Inside the walls of what was once the largest and most sophisticated city in the world, the population has been surviving for more than a year on things that people in ordinary times do not call food. The chronicles of the Jin dynasty record what happened in the late stages of the siege with a flatness that is somehow more disturbing than any dramatization could be. The people ate leather, and they stripped bark from the few trees that had not already been used for fuel. When the leather and the bark were gone, they ate the dead. The city of Kaifeng in the 1230s has roughly 1 million inhabitants. Understand what that number means in 1232. London at this moment has perhaps 80,000 people. Paris has around 200,000. Baghdad, once the largest city in the Islamic world, has been diminished by its own troubles. Kaifeng is in a different category entirely. An urban civilization at the scale that Europe will not achieve for another 4 centuries, a metropolis of markets and workshops and canals and pleasure quarters and administrative bureaus and paper money and printed books and restaurants that serve 100 different dishes. It has been under Mongol siege since 1231. Outside the walls, and the army of the great Khan has constructed a city of its own. The siege lines extend for miles. There are Mongol heavy cavalry units, Mongol light cavalry, but also Chinese engineers from the armies the Mongols have already absorbed, Persian siege specialists whose knowledge of fortification and counter-fortification has been recruited along with everything else useful in the territories the empire has consumed. There are trebuchets. There are what the chronicles describe as firebombs. Ceramic shells packed with incendiary compounds, hurled over the walls to land among wooden buildings and paper screens and panic. There are ballistas large enough to throw bolts that punch through multiple ranks of defenders. The technology of destruction being brought to bear on Kaifeng is the accumulated military knowledge of half the known world, gathered under a single command. The single command is Ögedei Khan. He is not here in person. The great Khan rules the Mongol Empire from Karakorum in Mongolia, thousands of miles to the north and west, receiving dispatches and issuing orders through the relay stations of the Yam network that his couriers ride day and night to maintain. But every soldier before these walls, every siege engine, every decision about how long to maintain the encirclement rather than attempt direct assault, flows from his authority. The campaign against the Jin dynasty is his campaign. The suffering inside these walls is his design. The defenders of Kaifeng are fighting with a desperation that the chroniclers document with a specificity unusual in medieval military history. The Jin general Puxian Wanu has committed suicide rather than face capture, and the Jin emperor Aizong has fled the city months before the final siege. An escape that the population regards as abandonment, which it is. The soldiers on the walls are dying not primarily from Mongol arrows, but from the diseases that emerge when 1 million people are crowded behind walls with failing food supplies and inadequate sanitation. Typhus, dysentery. Whatever words the Jin dynasty chronicles use for the things that kill people when a city is dying. The Mongol commanders outside are debating a question that has come up before in this war and will come up again: what to do with a city that has resisted to the last. The doctrine established by Genghis Khan is clear in its outlines and flexible in its application. A city that surrenders before a siege begins is to be administered efficiently and taxed. Like a city that surrenders during a siege may receive mercy or may not, depending on the commanders and the circumstances. A city that fights to the end, that forces the Mongols to deploy their full resources and spend the lives of their soldiers, is to be destroyed. Not always in the same way. Not with the identical result every time, but destroyed in a manner sufficient to demonstrate to the next city on the route that resistance is not a viable strategy. Kai Feng has fought to the end. Not by choice exactly. There were negotiations, there were envoys, there were the usual diplomatic exchanges that accompany sieges of this kind. But the circumstances never aligned for a clean surrender. And now the walls are about to fall, and the question of what happens next is being decided in councils that the chronicles preserve only in fragments. Now the city falls in 1233. The exact nature of the fall, the extent of the killing, the proportion of the population that survives, is a matter that historians have debated for decades, because the sources are fragmentary and interested, and contradict each other in the way that sources from the inside and outside of any catastrophe always do. What is not disputed is this. Kai Feng is destroyed as a functioning urban civilization. The canals that made it possible, the administrative infrastructure that sustained its millions, the physical fabric of its buildings and markets and workshops, all of it is dismantled or burned or simply abandoned to the consequences of the year of siege. The population that survives the immediate military action is dispersed, enslaved, or left to scatter into a countryside that has itself been devastated by the advancing war. Within a generation, Kai Feng is no longer a city in any meaningful sense. The land where 1 million people lived and worked and ate and argued and made things is agricultural land, or wasteland, or emptiness. Now step back from those walls. Step back far enough to see what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the industrial application of a method. You are looking at a system that was still being calibrated when Genghis Khan died in 1227, and that has, in the years since his death, been refined into something extraordinary. A machine for the conversion of entire civilizations into territory under Mongol control, operated across a front that stretches from the Sea of Japan to the borders of Poland, coordinated from a tent city on the Mongolian steppe by a man who understands, with a clarity that very few rulers in history have matched, that war at this scale is not primarily a military problem. It is a logistical one. It is an administrative one. It is a question of systems. The man who has built those systems, who sits in Karakorum receiving the dispatches and issuing the orders and making the decisions that determine whether Kai Feng is spared or destroyed, whether the campaign against the Jin is continued or paused, whether the armies that have crushed Russia will now turn toward Poland or toward Hungary, or toward both simultaneously. That man is Ögedei Khan, second son of Genghis Khan, third great Khan of the Mongol Empire. The man who took a war machine built by a genius and turned it into something the world had never seen and has never quite seen again. We need to understand the world he inherited. We need to understand the world he destroyed. And we need to understand the man himself. The generous drinker, the steady administrator, the son who spent his entire reign in the shadow of a father whose legend grew larger every year, and who responded to that shadow not by retreating into it, but by expanding the empire his father built until it covered more of the earth than any empire before or since. We go back. We go all the way back. There were people in Kaifeng in 1232 who remembered what the city had been. There were old merchants who could remember the floating restaurants on the Grand Canal, the barges laden with silk and lacquerware that moved through the city's water system in a constant commerce. There were scholars who could remember the libraries, the printing houses, the government examinations that drew the best minds of northern China to compete for administrative positions in a state that had been, before the war, one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic civilizations in human history. There were craftspeople who could remember the bronze workshops, the ceramic kilns, the iron foundries that had made Kaifeng one of the greatest manufacturing centers in the medieval world. Those memories were all that remained of most of those things by 1232. The workshops had been converted to war production or abandoned. The libraries had been stripped for fuel. The canals, clogged and neglected, and no longer moved with the commerce that had defined them. The examinations had not been held since the Mongol pressure on the northern borders had converted the entire administrative apparatus of the Jin state into a war machine that was losing its war. What remained was the wall. The wall of Kaifeng was a serious piece of engineering, a perimeter of packed earth and brick that stretched for miles around the city, built and rebuilt over centuries specifically to resist the enemies that the geography of northern China had always sent against its cities. The Jin dynasty's engineers had added to it, reinforced it, equipped it with towers and gates and the systems for pouring hot oil and dropping stones that represented the state of the art in fortification at the time. The Mongol siege engineers looked at the wall of Kaifeng and began their calculations. The siege operations that reduce Kaifeng are documented in both Chinese and Mongol sources, and the picture they produce is of a systematic, patient, almost methodical application of overwhelming force. The Mongols do not attempt to rush the walls. They do not launch the kind of frontal assault that would spend Mongol lives against prepared defenses. They build their encirclement. They establish their siege lines, they bring up the engines, and they begin the process of making the city's position untenable through a combination of starvation, artillery bombardment, and the psychological weight of knowing that there is no relief coming. There is no relief coming because the Jin dynasty, by 1231, has no army capable of fighting its way through the Mongol lines to reach Kaifeng. The armies that might have broken a siege have already been destroyed in the campaigns of the preceding years. The dynasty has lost its northern territories, its cavalry recruiting grounds, its access to the horses that Chinese armies have always struggled to produce in sufficient quantity. It is fighting with infantry defending fixed positions, which is exactly what the Mongol siege system is designed to defeat. The year of the siege is a year of slow dying. The chronicles record the stages with a clinical precision. First the luxury goods run out, then the normal food, then the supplementary food, then the things people are not supposed to eat. By the final months, the people inside the walls are burning furniture for heat and competing for the scraps of leather that can be boiled into something that passes for sustenance. Disease moves through the crowded, weakened population with the efficiency that disease always achieves when it encounters bodies that have already been compromised by starvation. The garrison fights. This is worth saying. The soldiers on the walls of Kaifeng, many of them dying of the same diseases and starvation as the civilian population, continue to resist the Mongol assault with a determination that the chronicles on both sides document with something approaching respect. They know what happens to cities that resist. The record of the Mongol campaigns through northern China has given them a clear picture of the alternative. They resist anyway, because the alternative is to surrender to an enemy that has already demonstrated that surrender sometimes produces mercy and sometimes does not. And because the soldiers defending the walls are soldiers, and soldiers fight, the city falls not through a dramatic assault, but through the accumulated weight of the siege, through the moment when the garrison's ability to maintain the walls is finally exhausted by starvation and disease, when the defenders are too weakened to prevent the Mongol forces from achieving a breach and exploiting it. The chronicles do not provide a single dramatic moment of conquest. They provide a picture of gradual dissolution, the city losing its ability to function as a city before it loses its ability to function as a fortress, and then losing both simultaneously. That what happens to the population in the aftermath is documented imprecisely and contested in the sources. The Mongol commanders debated in the councils before the final assault what policy to apply. There are accounts of intercession, of Yelu Chukai, the Khitan administrator who serves as Ögedei's most important civilian advisor, arguing for the preservation of the skilled population rather than its massacre, pointing out the economic value of artisans, engineers, and administrators who can serve the empire's needs. There are accounts of the commanders accepting this argument. There are also accounts of significant killing. The honest summary is this: Kaifeng survives as a geographic location, but ceases to be a functioning city for a generation or more. Its population, whatever portion survives the siege and its immediate aftermath, is dispersed, enslaved, or left to survive in a city whose infrastructure has been destroyed. The canals do not flow again for decades. The markets do not reopen. The libraries are gone. The city that was, by any measure, one of the greatest urban civilizations in human history at the turn of the 13th century, has become, by 1233, a problem solved. To understand what Ögedei Khan inherits in 1229, you have to understand what Genghis Khan actually built, not the myth of it, which has been accreting since the 13th century, and which combines equal parts horror and grudging admiration, but the structural reality of it, the specific thing that Genghis created that was genuinely new in the world. Because before Genghis, there were nomadic confederations. There had always been nomadic confederations on the Eurasian steppe, waves of them cycling through history, in a pattern that the settled civilizations on the steppe's margins had learned to fear and dread and accommodate. The Huns, the Turks, the Khitans, the Yurkians, the whole long sequence of peoples who emerged from the grasslands and crashed against the walls of China or Persia or Byzantium, and sometimes broke through and sometimes receded. The steppe produced warriors of extraordinary quality. The horse-archer tradition of the Mongolian grasslands produced men who could do things from horseback that soldiers in any other military tradition could not match. The nomadic life produced people accustomed to hardship and mobility and the quick, violent resolution of conflict. What it didn't produce, none before Genghis, was a system. Genghis Khan's achievement, and it is, as a political and military achievement, one of the most extraordinary things any single human being has accomplished, is to take the raw material of steppe warrior culture and impose on it a structure that converts it from a raiding confederation into an empire. He does this through a series of specific, deliberate, structurally innovative choices that distinguish the Mongol Empire from every previous nomadic polity. He abolishes the tribal aristocracy. Before Genghis, Mongol society was organized around lineage. You commanded troops based on your birth rank. You received loyalty based on your genealogical position in the tribal hierarchy. Genghis replaces this with a merit system. Promotion in the Mongol military is based on demonstrated loyalty and proven ability in the field. A man of low birth who shows exceptional judgment in battle can rise to command 2 men, 10,000 warriors, over the heads of men born into the elite. This is not democracy. It is meritocracy in service of conquest, but it produces a military leadership class that is genuinely competent rather than merely well-born. And that competence matters enormously in the campaigns that follow. He creates the decimal system of military organization. The army is divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These units have standardized training, standardized tactics, standardized communication protocols. An army of 200,000 Mongol warriors, deployed across a front of hundreds of miles, can execute coordinated maneuvers, because every unit in every part of the line is operating according to the same doctrinal framework. The coordination that allows a Mongol army to perform the fake retreat, the classic tactic of appearing to flee, drawing pursuit, then turning and destroying the pursuing force, is only possible because the units are trained to the same standard and trust each other to execute the same plan simultaneously. He institutionalizes the policy of exemplary destruction. This is, in the long run, perhaps the most consequential of his innovations, the one that matters most for the scale of human suffering that his empire produces. The policy is simple in its formulation and devastating in its application. Cities that surrender before a siege begins are to be treated relatively well, have their populations allowed to continue their lives under Mongol administration and taxation. Cities that resist are to be destroyed, their populations killed or enslaved, their physical infrastructure dismantled. The information about what happens to resisting cities is to be propagated as widely as possible, so that the next city on the route knows the choice it faces. This is not random violence. It is calculated violence in service of a strategic goal, the conversion of military conquest into administrative submission at minimum cost in Mongol leaves. If every city surrenders before the siege engines arrive, the Mongol army can cover enormous distances without the costly, time-consuming siege operations that break armies and exhaust logistics. The massacre of Ögedei, the destruction of Merv, and the elimination of Nishapur. These are not expressions of blind rage. They are demonstrations. They are messages sent to every other city in Central Asia and Persia about what the choice between submission and resistance will cost. Genghis Khan is, by the time of his death in 1227, already the most successful conqueror in recorded history, by almost any measure you choose to apply. The territory under Mongol control stretches from the Korean peninsula in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west, from the forests of Siberia in the north to the northern plains of India in the south. He has destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. In a campaign of approximately 2 years, he has overrun northern China, and he has shattered every steppe confederation that was not already integrated into the Mongol system. He has created the institutional framework within which all of this is maintained. The laws of the Yasa, the administrative apparatus staffed by conquered peoples whose literacy and bureaucratic skills the Mongols lack, but recognize the value of the Yam postal relay system that allows communication across the empire. But the empire, at the moment of his death, is still primarily a military machine. It is not yet a state in the full sense of the word. It does not have a permanent capital. It does not have a systematic approach to the taxation and administration of its conquered territories. Its unity depends on the personal authority of Genghis Khan, and when that authority ends in 1227, the question of what holds it together is genuinely open. The succession crisis that follows Genghis's death is not as severe as it might have been, because Genghis had been thinking about it for years. The structure of the Mongol system is hierarchical in ways that make the question of succession both obvious and complicated. Obvious because someone must lead the cruelty, the great assembly of Mongol princes and chieftains, and that leader must be a son of Genghis. Complicated because Genghis had 4 sons by his primary wife Borte, and each of them has a claim. Jochi is the oldest, but Koki's paternity has been questioned since his birth. He was conceived during a period when Borte was a captive of a rival tribe, and the shadow of illegitimacy follows him. He dies, possibly murdered on his father's orders, in early 1227, before Genghis himself. Chagatai is the second son, capable but hot-tempered, given to violent quarrels that make him an unlikely choice to hold the empire together. Tolui is the youngest of the four principal sons, a brilliant military commander, but one who has not shown the political skills that coordinating the various factions of the Mongol elite will require. And Ögedei is the third son, described in the sources as generous, politically deft, capable of serving as a bridge between the competing ambitions of his brothers and the various factions within the Mongol aristocracy. Genghis nominates Ögedei as his preferred successor while still alive. The Kurultai of 1229 confirms this choice, as after 2 years of negotiations and maneuvering that leave no surviving detailed record, but that clearly involved all the political skills that Ögedei possesses in abundance. He is elected Great Khan, and the empire that his father built becomes his to manage. He receives the military system in good working order. He receives a partially functional administrative system built primarily on the labor of conquered Chinese and Persian bureaucrats. He receives the loyalty of an extraordinarily capable military establishment, including generals like Subutai, arguably the greatest military mind of the medieval world, who has been responsible for much of the tactical genius behind Mongol victories from China to the Caspian. And he receives something less tangible but equally important. The momentum. The empire is moving. The campaigns that Genghis had set in motion are paused but not concluded. The Jin dynasty in northern China is weakened but not defeated. The lands of the Rus principalities are known quantities, mapped by Subutai's reconnaissance expeditions of the 1220s, ready to be invaded when the resources and the decision are assembled. The world that Ögedei inherits is not simply a large collection of conquered territory. It is a system in motion, an imperial machine that requires continuous operation to maintain its function, that depends on ongoing conquest both for the material resources, the tribute, the slaves, the horses, the military equipment, and for the political cohesion that only the momentum of shared victory can sustain in a society organized around warfare. The empire must expand, not because Ögedei desires it for its own sake, though he does desire it, or at least desires the prestige and the tribute that expansion produces, but because an empire that stops expanding is an empire that begins to fragment, and Ögedei has watched closely enough to understand this. The centrifugal forces within the Mongol elite, the competing ambitions of his brothers and cousins, the loyalty of the regional commanders to their own interests as much as to the central authority, are held in check partly by his personal political skills and partly by the shared project of conquest. Remove the shared project, and the centrifugal forces will have nothing to push against. So the campaigns resume. They resume in northern China, where the Jin dynasty is ground down through a combination of sustained military pressure and the administrative absorption of its former territory. They resume in Korea, which is invaded in 1231 and progressively subjugated over the following decades. They resume in Persia, where the Ilkhanate that will formally emerge only under later rulers is already taking shape in the campaigns and administrative appointments that Ögedei authorizes. And they begin. This is the decision that matters most for the history of the world west of the Urals. In the lands of the Rus principalities. The campaign in the west is Ögedei's greatest strategic decision. It is also the decision that most clearly demonstrates what he has added to his father's system, the capacity to conduct simultaneous large-scale campaigns on multiple fronts, is coordinated from a central command structure, sustained by a logistical network that can supply armies at distances that would have been impossible for any previous military organization. Genghis Khan was a genius of sequential conquest. He moved his armies in one direction, destroyed what was in front of him, absorbed the resources of the defeated, and moved on. Ögedei is a genius of parallel conquest. He manages multiple campaigns simultaneously, shifting resources between fronts as the situation demands, using the YAM network to maintain strategic coordination across distances of thousands of miles. The campaign that destroys Kiev and pushes into Poland and Hungary is happening at the same time as the final campaigns against the Jin, at the same time as operations in Korea, and at the same time as administrative consolidation across Central Asia and Persia. This is unprecedented. This is new in the world, and the person who made it possible is not the charismatic warrior on horseback, but the administrator in Karakorum, reading dispatches and sending orders and managing the empire the way a general manages a battle, with an eye on every front simultaneously, moving resources to where they are most needed, deciding which cities will receive the full weight of Mongol power and which will be left to ripen for a later campaign. The world in the first half of the 13th century does not yet know what is coming for it. The scholars of Baghdad are still writing in the world's most advanced libraries. The princes of Poland and Hungary are still fighting each other over territory neither of them will hold for much longer. The merchants of the Silk Road cities are still calculating profit margins. The Japanese are still receding from the memory of an early Mongol contact that they do not yet realize is a prelude. They are all, in their different ways, about to learn something new about what the world is capable of producing, and the lesson is being designed in Karakorum. The civilizations that the Mongol Empire encounters and destroys are not static targets waiting to be conquered. They are dynamic, sophisticated, and in many cases at or near the peak of their historical development in the early 13th century. This matters because the scale of the loss is the scale of what actually existed. See, and what existed in the world that the Mongols conquer is extraordinary. The Jin dynasty that Ögedei finalizes the destruction of is the successor state to the Yurshan conquest of northern China in the early 12th century. And whatever the political complexities of its origins, by the early 13th century it governs one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. Jin China in 1200 has paper money, printed books, gunpowder weapons, sophisticated textile manufacturing, iron production at scales that Europe will not match for centuries, canal systems that move goods across hundreds of miles, and a civil service examination system that selects administrators on the basis of merit rather than birth. The population of northern China under the Jin is the largest concentration of human beings in any single political unit on Earth at that time. The cities of Central Asia that the campaigns of Genghis and Ögedei reduced to rubble are the intellectual centers of the Islamic world. Merv, at its peak in the 12th century, is described by contemporaries as one of the most magnificent cities in the world, a city of gardens and mosques and madrasas and libraries, a center of scholarship in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. The scholars of Merv and Nishapur and Bukhara and Samarkand are producing the work that will, through eventual transmission to Europe, help generate the scientific revolution, the mathematical knowledge, the astronomical observations, and the philosophical translations of Greek texts that flow through these cities are part of the intellectual infrastructure of the medieval world. When the Mongols arrive, these cities have choices. The chronicles record the sequence with a consistency that reflects systematic policy. The city is approached Envoys are sent demanding surrender. The city is given the option of submitting and paying tribute or facing destruction. Many cities surrender. Some cities resist. The cities that resist are destroyed with a thoroughness that goes beyond military necessity and reflects the deliberate communication of a message. This is what resistance costs. Merv surrenders initially and is then destroyed in the aftermath of a revolt. Nishapur surrenders, then kills a Mongol commander, then is destroyed completely. Ogurgench surrenders too late and is destroyed anyway. Or rather, the city is flooded by diverting the Amu Darya River, a feat of hydraulic engineering in service of destruction that required more ingenuity than most of the military operations. The Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II, whose confrontation with Genghis Khan begins the Central Asian campaigns, makes a series of catastrophic strategic errors that the chronicles of every tradition, from Mongol to Persian to Chinese, agree on. He distributes his army among his cities rather than concentrating it for a field engagement that might have posed a genuine challenge to Mongol cavalry tactics. He flees rather than making a stand that might have rallied his forces. He dies on an island in the Caspian Sea. So, having spent his final months moving from refuge to refuge as the Mongol pursuit closed in, the ruler of one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, reduced to a fugitive dying of illness and despair. His son, Jalal ad-Din, fights on with genuine skill and courage, winning one of the only real tactical victories over Mongol forces in this period, and is eventually defeated and killed. Not by the Mongols directly, but by assassins in 1231, after years of resistance that accomplishes little except to demonstrate that individual military skill cannot overcome a system. The system is the point. Individual heroism, individual tactical genius, individual political will. None of these are sufficient against what Ögedei has built. Say, because what Ögedei has built does not depend on any individual and cannot be defeated at the individual level. The generals of the cities that resist him are often capable. The armies that face his two-mens sometimes fight with extraordinary courage. It makes no difference to the outcome, because the outcome is determined not by the quality of individual combatants, but by the quality of the systems, the logistics, the intelligence, the coordination, the siege technology, the accumulated momentum of an empire that has been expanding for 30 years and has absorbed the military knowledge of half the world into its own. The Russian princes who faced the Mongol invasion in 1237 make the same structural error as the Khwarezmian Shah. They fail to combine. The Principality of Ryazan sends to Vladimir and Moscow for help and receives nothing. Vladimir sends no help to Ryazan and then faces the Mongols alone. The political divisions of the Rus world, the competing principalities, the personal rivalries of the princes, the inability to subordinate individual interests to the common defense, produce the same result that military incapacity would have produced. Each principality is defeated in turn, in sequence, by an army that is always stronger than any single defender, and that does not need to face them simultaneously. Europe, watching the destruction of the Rus principalities from a distance that allows selective attention, fails to absorb the lesson. The Polish and Hungarian kingdoms that faced the Mongol advance in 1241 are better prepared than the Rus principalities. They have had warning, or they have time to marshal their forces, and they are still destroyed at Legnica and Mohi with an efficiency that leaves their defenders unable to explain what happened except by recourse to divine punishment or supernatural power. It is not supernatural. It is system. Ögedei Khan is born around 1186 on the Mongolian steppe, and the steppe is not a metaphor or a backdrop. It is a physical reality that shapes every aspect of the life lived within it. And to understand the people it produces, you need to understand what the steppe actually is and what it demands of those who survive it. The Mongolian steppe is one of the largest grassland ecosystems on Earth, a sea of grass and wind that stretches from the forests of Siberia in the north to the Gobi Desert in the south, and from the mountains of Central Asia in the west to the forests of Manchuria in the east. It is a landscape of extreme temperature variation, summer heat that can exceed 40 degrees Celsius, winter cold that can fall to -40, and of extreme weather unpredictability, with droughts and blizzards and the catastrophic storms called tsud that can kill an entire herd of horses and cattle overnight. The people who have learned to live on this landscape have done so by developing a specific set of adaptations. Mobility, because no fixed location is sustainable through all seasons. Toughness, because the landscape has no tolerance for weakness. Martial skill, because the steppe supports a carrying capacity that is never quite sufficient for the number of people competing to survive on it. And competition over pasture and water and horses is resolved by violence. The child who becomes Ögedei Khan is the third son of Temujin, the man who will become Genghis Khan, and his primary wife, Borte. He is raised in a family that is, at the moment of his birth, in the process of rising from a relatively obscure position within the Mongol tribal structure to something approaching dominance. But that dominance is not yet secure, and the years of Ögedei's childhood are years of ongoing warfare, of alliances made and broken, of the constant calculation of loyalty and danger that characterizes political life on the steppe at its most intense. He is, by all accounts, a child who watches and listens and absorbs. And the sources about Ögedei's early life are limited. Medieval Mongolian society had no tradition of biographical writing in the European sense, and the principal source for this period, the secret history of the Mongols, is partly mythological and was compiled after the fact. But the portrait that emerges from the fragments is consistent. A boy who is observant rather than aggressive, who learns by watching rather than by doing, who processes the world around him with a patience unusual in a culture that prizes speed and decisiveness above most other qualities. He is also, from an early age, known for his generosity. This quality is noted in the sources with sufficient frequency that it reflects something real rather than conventional praise. Mongol culture placed high value on a chief's generosity, the distribution of wealth from successful raids and campaigns to the warriors who conducted them, the maintenance of the feasts and gifts through which political loyalty was expressed and sustained. Genghis Khan was generous in this political sense. His warriors followed him in part because following him paid in horses and cattle and silk and silver. Ögedei is generous in a more personal sense. He gives away things he does not need to give away. He does not bargain over the division of spoils. He maintains a household where visitors are welcome and where the cups are not allowed to be empty. This personal generosity has a political dimension that Ögedei is aware of and that he uses deliberately. In a system where loyalty is always partly a transaction, where the Mongol princes and generals are always calculating whether their service to the great Khan is being adequately compensated, Ögedei's extravagance is a form of political investment. He builds relationships through gifts. He creates obligations through generosity. He maintains the loyalty of men who might otherwise drift toward his brothers by making himself the person in the empire who gives the most and demands the least in return. The drinking is also real, and also noted consistently across sources that have different attitudes toward Ögedei and different reasons to praise or diminish him. He drinks heavily. He drinks in the Mongol fashion. Fermented mare's milk, and then eventually the stronger distillates that the technology of conquest brings within his reach, with a consistency and a volume that his subordinates worry about, and that his father explicitly warned him against. Genghis Khan, according to the secret history, tells Ögedei before his death to moderate his drinking, to not let it interfere with the management of the empire. Ögedei reportedly agrees and then continues to drink. His doctors tell him it is killing him. He acknowledges this and continues. He reduces the number of cups he drinks per day, from the extremely large number he was drinking to a somewhat smaller large number, and presents this as compliance with the medical advice. This is not ignorance of the consequences. It is a man who knows exactly what he is doing and has decided that the pleasure is worth the price. And this detail matters for understanding Ögedei because it reveals something important about the texture of his self-awareness. He's not a man who deceives himself about his own nature. He knows that he drinks too much. He knows that his generosity sometimes creates problems, that giving away resources he needs for the administration of the empire is not purely virtuous, even in Mongol terms. He knows that his political role requires managing his brother's ambitions, that Chagatai watches him with a critical eye, and Tolui's military prestige is a constant, implicit challenge. He knows all of this, and he manages all of it with a pragmatic clarity that is one of the things that distinguishes him as a ruler. He is also, beneath the generosity and the drinking and the political skill, 'tis something that is harder to define and that the sources gesture at without quite capturing, ambitious. Not in the personal, performative way of Enver Pasha or Napoleon or the other self-mythologizing conquerors that history is full of. Ambitious in a quieter, more structural sense. Ambitious for the project, for the empire, for the continuation and expansion of the thing his father built. He is not trying to prove himself to the world. He is trying to prove himself to the memory of his father, which is a different and more demanding audience. Genghis Khan is, by the time of his death in 1227, already in the process of becoming a legend. Within the Mongol elite that Ögedei governs, the memory of Genghis functions as a standard against which all subsequent action is measured. Did the great Khan do as his father would have? Or did the campaign succeed as his father would have succeeded? Did the empire expand as his father would have expanded it? These are the questions that Ögedei's political environment constantly poses, and they are not idle questions. They have implications for the loyalty of the military commanders, for the respect of the Mongol princes, for the cohesion of the empire that his father's personal authority had cemented. Ögedei's response to this pressure is not imitation. He is too intelligent to try to be Genghis Khan, and too honest to pretend that he is. Genghis was a charismatic warrior who led from the front, who inspired loyalty through personal magnetism and military genius, who built the empire through an extraordinary combination of strategic vision and tactical brilliance. Ögedei is an administrator, he is a coordinator, and he is a man who understands complex systems and knows how to manage them. These are different skills, and Ögedei does not pretend they are the same. What he does instead is something more interesting. He constructs a version of the imperial project that is genuinely his own, that builds on what his father created but extends it in directions his father never quite achieved, and that proves, in its outcomes, if not in its methods, worthy of the comparison. Genghis conquered. Ögedei administered conquest on a scale that Genghis never had the administrative machinery to achieve. Genghis built the weapon, Ögedei industrialized it. The construction of Karakorum is the most visible symbol of this. Before Ögedei, the Mongol Empire has no fixed capital. Genghis governed from wherever his mobile court happened to be. a vast tent city that moved with the seasons and the campaigns, carrying the administrative apparatus of the empire in its wagons. This is appropriate for a warrior conqueror, for the leader of a mobile military machine. It is not appropriate for the ruler of an empire that spans a continent and requires the permanent coordination of administrators, diplomats, merchants, and religious figures from dozens of different traditions. Ögedei orders the construction of Karakorum in the Orkhon Valley of Mongolia, and though the city is modest by the standards of the great urban civilizations, his armies are destroying elsewhere. The Venetian diplomat, William of Rubruck, who visits in the 1250s, he notes with some bemusement that the whole city is smaller than the suburb of Saint-Denis outside Paris. It serves a function that its physical size does not fully convey. Karakorum is a statement. It says, there is a center. There is a place from which the empire is governed. There is a fixed point of authority that exists independently of the person of the ruler, that persists between campaigns, that gives the empire a kind of permanence that a mobile tent court cannot provide. Around Karakorum, Ögedei builds the infrastructure of permanent administration. He expands and systematizes the YAM network, the relay station system that allows messages to move across the empire at speeds that no previous communication system has achieved. He establishes taxation systems for the conquered territories, extracting resources in a regular and predictable way rather than through the ad hoc looting of military campaigns. He recruits administrators from the populations his armies have conquered, Chinese bureaucrats who understand the systems of the Jin dynasty, Persian scribes who can manage the accounts of the Central Asian territories, Khitan officials whose expertise in Chinese-style administration is available precisely because the Mongols have absorbed the Khitan state. This is one of the most remarkable features of the Mongol administrative system, and it is largely Ögedei's contribution, the willingness to use the expertise of conquered peoples to administer the conquered people's own territories. The Mongols have no tradition of bureaucratic governance. The steppe does not produce bureaucrats, because the steppe has no need for them. What the Mongols have is the ruthlessness to compel conquered people to administer their own subjection, and the pragmatism to recognize that the subjection will be more efficiently maintained by the people who understand the territory than by Mongol warriors who do not. Ögedei himself does not manage the day-to-day details of this administrative work. He has ministers for that. Most prominently, Yelu Chukai, a Khitan administrator whose influence on the early Mongol imperial bureaucracy is profound and whose specific contribution to the history of North China is a matter of ongoing historical debate. The question that Yelu Chukai repeatedly poses to Ögedei and that Ögedei repeatedly weighs, this is the question that defines Mongol governance in the early imperial period. Is it more valuable to kill the conquered population and use their land for pasture, or to let them live and tax them? This is not a rhetorical question. It was seriously debated within the Mongol elite in the aftermath of the conquest of northern China, and the answer, to tax rather than kill, was not inevitable. It was a policy choice, made against the preference of advisors who genuinely argue that depopulating the land for pasture made more strategic sense. The fact that Ögedei ultimately decides in favor of administration rather than annihilation for the settled civilizations of northern China has implications for the scale of death there that are real even if they are impossible to quantify precisely. It does not mean that mass killing stops, but it means that mass killing is a tool deployed when useful rather than the default outcome. The complexity of Ögedei's character is the complexity of a man who can make this calculation. who can weigh the administrative value of a living population against the military cost of controlling it, while simultaneously authorizing campaigns in Eastern Europe that destroy Kiev so thoroughly that when the Polish friar Carpini passes through in 1245, he finds nothing there but fields of human bones. The same man who decides to tax rather than annihilate in China authorizes the annihilation of the Rus principalities as a strategic demonstration. He is not confused about this. He's not hypocritical. He's applying the same pragmatic framework to two different strategic situations and arriving at two different conclusions. Not because the situations are genuinely different. Northern China is a territory the Mongols intend to administer and profit from. The Rus principalities are a pathway into Europe, and what matters there is not administration, but demonstration. The demonstration, delivered at the necessary scale of violence, that resistance is not viable, that no city is safe behind its walls, that the Mongol army can do what it says it can do. Kaifeng is a demonstration. Kiev is a demonstration. The demonstration requires the destruction, and Ögedei authorizes it with the same steady pragmatism with which he authorizes everything else. He is, in the deepest sense, a man of the system, not in the way that Himmler is a man of the system, not a bureaucrat in the industrial sense, not someone whose primary satisfaction is in the correct processing of forms and the meeting of production targets, but a man who has grasped, with a clarity unusual even among the most capable rulers, that what an empire does is ultimately determined by the quality of the systems it operates rather than by the quality of any individual within it. Genghis Khan was a genius. The empire that Genghis Khan built was therefore partially dependent on the continuation of that genius. Ögedei builds systems that do not require genius to operate, systems that a competent administrator and a capable general can run, systems that will produce the same outcomes whether Ögedei himself is present or absent, drunk or sober, in good health or dying. This is his greatest achievement and his most enduring legacy, that he makes the empire independent of any single person's exceptional ability. He makes it, in a meaningful sense, self-sustaining. And a self-sustaining empire of this size, with this military capacity and this administrative reach, is the most dangerous thing that has ever existed in the world at this point in history. The relationship between Ögedei Khan and his generals is one of the most important and least examined features of the Mongol Empire's operation under his reign. Because Ögedei is not a field commander, he does not lead armies in battle, does not conduct sieges in person, does not make the immediate tactical decisions that determine the outcome of any given engagement. He is the strategic director, the resource allocator, the political coordinator. The military execution depends on men like Subutai, and the relationship between Ögedei and Subutai is worth examining as a case study in how the empire actually functions. Subutai Batur is, by any measure that can be applied to medieval military figures, one of the greatest military commanders who ever lived. His operational record, the number of enemies he defeats, the distances over which he campaigns, the tactical and strategic problems he solves, is without parallel in the medieval world, and arguably without equal in any period. He conducts campaigns from China to Hungary. He defeats enemies on terrain ranging from the Mongolian steppe to the forests of Russia, to the plains of Eastern Europe. He executes multi-column operations of a complexity that would challenge modern military planners. He is, by the time of Ögedei's reign, and already a legend within the Mongol military establishment. He is also, crucially, not Ögedei's peer or rival. He is Ögedei's instrument. Subutai commands in the field because Ögedei appoints him to command in the field, and the campaigns that Subutai conducts are campaigns that Ögedei has authorized, resourced, and given strategic objectives. The specific genius, the tactical brilliance, the logistical mastery, the intelligence operations, belongs to Subutai. The decision to deploy that genius against a specific set of targets at a specific time, with specific forces and specific resources, belongs to Ögedei. This division of labor is precisely what makes the system so effective and so different from previous empires. The Roman Empire, at its height, combined strategic direction and field command in its emperors. When it worked, and as with Caesar or Trajan, it was formidable. When the emperor was a poor general, as with Valerian, the consequences were catastrophic. The Mongol system separates these functions deliberately, placing the strategic direction with the Great Khan and the operational command with specialized military professionals, and connecting them through a communication system fast enough to allow effective coordination. Ögedei's other great general of the Western campaigns is Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis through Jochi, who commands the Golden Horde and provides the political authority for the Western campaign. The relationship between Batu and Subutai is itself a study in the management of strong personalities within the Mongol elite. Batu is the senior prince, or the one who provides the legitimacy for the campaign in the eyes of the Mongol aristocracy. Subutai is the actual military mind. They operate together with a functional effectiveness that reflects Ögedei's skill in managing the political relationships that make military cooperation possible. The tension in this management is real and documented. The Great Banquet Controversy, described in the Secret History, occurs in the aftermath of the campaign in the Rus Principalities. Batu arrives late to a feast, and when two of Ögedei's sons complain about this, with the contempt of princes for a son of the questionable paternity Jochi line, Batu responds with the confidence of a man who has just conquered half of Europe and sees no reason to show deference to men who have done nothing comparable. The argument reaches Ögedei, who manages it with the political skill that characterizes his handling of all the internal tensions of the Mongol elite. He reprimands his sons, preserves Batu's dignity, and keeps the coalition functional. This kind of political management, the constant, unglamorous work of maintaining the alliances and managing the egos and ensuring that the men who control the armies continue to serve the central authority rather than their own independent interests, is what Ögedei does that Genghis Khan's personal charisma did not need to do. Genghis commanded absolute loyalty through a combination of military genius and personal magnetism that simply made the question of rival ambitions less pressing. Ögedei manages the same problem through political skill, through generosity, or through the cultivation of relationships that make loyalty feel like a rational choice rather than an act of submission. He does this while drinking heavily. This is not incidental. The drinking is part of the political management, in fact. The feasts at which political relationships are maintained, the shared cups through which the Mongol aristocracy performs its solidarity and its subordination to the Great Khan's authority, are also the occasions for Ögedei's most significant consumption. He drinks in public at the feasts with his generals and his princes and his administrators, and the drinking is itself a political performance as much as a personal indulgence. His own awareness of this is documented in the story of the counting of cups. When his doctors warn him that his drinking is killing him, Ögedei agrees to reduce his intake, so he then demands that his cups be made larger, so that he is technically drinking fewer cups while consuming the same or greater quantity of Aragon wine. This is either the cleverest form of denial, or a man who understands himself well enough to know that the formal compliance is the best he can achieve, and who chooses to acknowledge the self-deception rather than pretend it is not happening. Either way, it suggests a degree of self-awareness unusual in absolute monarchs, who are not generally rewarded by their environment for being honest about their own limitations. The question of whether Ögedei felt, in any meaningful sense, the weight of what his campaigns were producing is not answerable from the sources we have. The chronicles do not give us access to his private thoughts. What we have is his behavior, his decisions, the patterns of his reign, and the occasional fragment of reported speech that the sources preserve. From these fragments, a portrait emerges of a man who is capable of genuine warmth toward his generals, toward his family, toward the subjects of the empire he governs, and who is simultaneously capable of authorizing the destruction of cities without apparent hesitation. These two capacities are not contradictory in the way that modern sensibility might expect them to be. Ögedei lives in a moral universe shaped by the Mongolian steppe, where the distinction between a legitimate target and a protected person is not drawn along the lines that post-Enlightenment ethics would draw it. The cities that resist are legitimate targets because they are part of the war. The people in them are part of the war because they sustain the resistance. The destruction of the city and its people is not murder in Ögedei's moral framework. It is conquest. This is not a justification. It is an explanation. The explanation matters because it prevents the easy mistake of imagining that what Ögedei does is something that only a monster could do. It is something that a man of his time and culture and circumstance could do and did, and the doing of it requires no special villainy. It requires, rather, the specific combination of administrative capability and strategic vision in the absence of the moral framework that would identify the people inside Kaifeng's walls as protected from the consequences of the city's resistance. He builds the system. The system does what systems do. It expands until something stops it. For by it to understand how the Mongol war machine under Ögedei actually functions, how it moves, how it kills, how it sustains itself across distances that defeat every other military organization of the era, you have to start with the horse. Not horses in the abstract, not horses as a symbol, but horses as a logistical reality. A Mongol warrior in the 1230s goes to war with multiple horses, typically between 3 and 5, sometimes more. This is not luxury. It is operational necessity. The central tactical capability of Mongol warfare is speed over long distances, and that speed requires the ability to switch horses regularly so that no single animal is run to exhaustion. A Mongol army traveling across the steppe can cover distances of 60, 70, and sometimes 80 miles per day. Several times the pace achievable by European heavy cavalry, which moves at perhaps 25 miles per day with a single war horse that cannot be exhausted before battle. The multiplication effect of this is not purely tactical. It is also logistical. An army of 100,000 Mongol warriors, each with 4 horses, requires the management of 400,000 horses. The horses graze on the steppe rather than requiring the grain supplies that European and Chinese armies depend on, which means that the Mongol army does not carry the enormous grain trains that constrain the speed and range of every other military force of the period. The army feeds itself from the land, which also means that it moves through territory in a way that strips that territory of the horses and cattle it needs. The advance of a Mongol army is not just a military event, but an ecological one. The decimal system of military organization that Genghis Khan established and that Ögedei inherits and maintains is the structural innovation that makes the coordination of this force possible. An arban of 10 warriors is the basic unit. 10 arbans make a zun of 100. 10 zuns make a mingan of 1,000. 10 mingans make a tumen of 10,000. The critical feature of this system is not the numbers, but the command structure. At each level, there is a designated commander with clear authority, clear accountability, and clear lines of communication, both upward to the next level and downward to the units under his command. This sounds simple. In practice, it is revolutionary that medieval European armies are organized around the personal loyalties of individual knights to their lords, complex webs of feudal obligation that produce armies of varying reliability, and that dissolve when the lord is killed or the money runs out. Medieval Chinese armies under the Jin dynasty are organized around a mix of professional standing forces and conscript levies, with a command structure that is subject to political interference from civilian administrators and to the internal politics of the officer corps. Neither system can produce the coordination that the Mongol decimal system achieves. The coordination allows something that is, in military history, genuinely remarkable. Multi-column operational maneuvers at scales that no other force of the period can match. The campaign that Subutai designs for the invasion of the Rus principalities in 1237 to 1242, authorized and resourced by Ögedei from Karakorum, involves multiple separate columns operating over a front of hundreds of miles, hitting multiple cities simultaneously or in rapid sequence so that no defender can concentrate force against any single column. The columns converging and diverging according to a plan that is coordinated from the center through the YAM relay network. The YAM is the nervous system of this operation, and under Ögedei, it reaches a scale that its founder probably did not anticipate. Relay stations are established every 25 to 40 miles across the empire, each station maintaining a supply of horses and riders. That a message sent from one end of the empire can reach the other end in days. Weeks for the longest distances, but weeks rather than the months that any other form of communication would require. This is faster than any political or military communication system that exists anywhere in the world in the 1230s. It means that Ögedei and Karakorum can receive a report of a military development in Poland and send a response that reaches the commanders in the field before the local commander would have had time to receive reinforcement from any neighboring force. The intelligence function of the Mongol system is equally important and equally underappreciated. Before the armies move, the spies move. Mongol intelligence operations routinely precede major campaigns by years. The merchants, often genuine merchants who are also gathering military intelligence, and sometimes pure intelligence operatives who use the merchant role as cover, map the roads, assess the condition of city walls, evaluate the political divisions within defending states, identify local populations who might be sympathetic to the invaders or at least indifferent to their arrival. The campaign plan that Subutai presents to Ögedei before the Western invasion is based on this intelligence work, much of it gathered during the great raid that Subutai and Jebe conducted in 1220 to 1223, which took 2 Mongol tumens through the Caucasus into the Rus principalities around the Caspian and back across Central Asia. A campaign of reconnaissance at a scale that no previous military force had attempted or could have executed, shows the siege capability is where the transformation under Ögedei is most visible and most important. Genghis Khan's original army is a force of horse archers, superb at the movement and maneuver of open-field warfare, less equipped for the reduction of fortified cities. The solution Genghis finds, which Ögedei inherits and expands, is the systematic recruitment of siege specialists from the conquered civilizations. Chinese engineers who understand gunpowder are integrated into the Mongol forces from the campaigns against the Jin and the Xixia. Persian engineers who understand the mathematics of trebuchet design and the construction of siege towers are recruited from the campaigns in Central Asia. The result is a siege capability that can bring together, for any given operation, the optimal combination of whatever technology has been absorbed from whatever civilization has been most recently conquered. The weapons that result from this synthesis are documented in the chronicles with a specificity that suggests their novelty and their effectiveness. Trebuchets that can throw stones of 200 pounds a distance of 300 yards, capable of systematically demolishing the sections of wall they target. Naphtha, bombs that create fire that water cannot extinguish, hurled over walls into the wooden interiors of cities where everything burns. Smoke bombs that create the psychological disorientation of a population that cannot see where the attackers are coming from. Mining operations that tunnel beneath walls and collapse them from below. To diversionary attacks that draw defenders to one section of the wall, while the actual breach is prepared elsewhere. The combination of this siege technology with the Mongol army's intelligence capability and its operational speed means that a city facing a Mongol besieging force is in a genuinely different situation than a city facing the siege capabilities of any previous enemy. Previous enemies could be bled down by determined defense, starved out, worn down, left to deal with disease in their camps. The Mongol sieges at Kaifeng and Kiev and the cities of Persia demonstrate that the Mongols can sustain siege operations indefinitely, that their logistics allow them to maintain a force outside a city for as long as necessary, and that the siege technology they bring is capable of reducing almost any fixed fortification if given enough time. The only strategy that consistently works against a Mongol siege is not resistance, but retreat and mobility. Fighting them on ground where their siege equipment cannot follow, in the forest, in the marsh, in the mountain terrain that cavalry cannot easily navigate. The Mongols have weaknesses. They struggle in heavily forested terrain. They struggle in tropical heat. They struggle against naval power. But the cities of the steppe and the plains and the river valleys, the cities where most of the world's population lives and most of the world's wealth is concentrated in the 13th century, have no natural refuge from an army that has mastered the reduction of every type of fortification. The policy of exemplary destruction is the final and in some ways most important component of the machine, because it is the component that does not require killing. Or rather, it is the component that makes killing so credibly inevitable that surrender, in many cases, occurs before the killing begins. The policy works through reputation. The Mongols invest actively in maintaining and spreading the reputation for total destruction of resistant cities. Survivors are sometimes deliberately released specifically to spread the word about what has happened. Merchants whose trade routes pass through Mongol-controlled territory carry the stories. The reports that filter back to cities that have not yet been reached are accurate. The Mongols really do kill the populations of cities that resist. They really do reduce the walls, whilst they really do leave nothing. And accurate reports are the most effective form of psychological warfare because they do not require embellishment. The result is that a significant proportion of the cities in the path of a Mongol advance surrender without requiring the full application of military force. Governors calculate the odds. They assess their walls and their garrison and their supply situation, and they compare it against the documented record of what happens to cities that fight the Mongols, and they conclude, correctly, that resistance will not save them and will guarantee the additional horror of the destruction policy. Surrender at least offers the possibility of surviving, of being taxed rather than killed, of the city continuing to exist in some form under Mongol administration. This is the genius of the policy, and it is a policy that Ögedei inherits and maintains. It is not simply cruelty. It is a system for converting the cost of conquest, measured in Mongol lives and Mongol resources spent on sieges, into information costs. The Mongols spend their resources on a small number of very public, very complete destructions, and they collect the return on that investment from every subsequent city that surrenders without requiring a siege. The campaign in the Rus principalities, authorized by Ögedei and executed by Batu Khan and Subutai, demonstrates all of these elements in combination. The Mongols crossed the Volga in the winter of 1237. This timing is deliberate. The frozen rivers that would normally provide natural obstacles to a cavalry advance become highways. The Mongols move in winter because their horses can travel across frozen terrain that would be impassable in spring mud, and because the cities of the Rus principalities have never seen an army attack across frozen rivers in the depths of winter. The first blow falls on the Principality of Ryazan. Ryazan sends to its neighbors for help. The neighbors, fragmented by the internal politics of the Rus feudal system, do not come. The city fights alone, and the city is destroyed. The chronicles describe the aftermath. The walls demolished, the churches burned, the population killed without apparent distinction by age or sex. The city left as rubble on the frozen steppe. The Mongols moved to Vladimir, then to Suzdal, then, in 1238, toward Novgorod. But Novgorod is saved by the spring thaw, which turns the approaches into impassable marsh before the Mongol cavalry can reach it. They turn south, they regroup, they return to the steppe. In 1240, they come back. This time the target is Kiev, the greatest city of the Rus world, the city that a Polish friar will describe as the metropolis and capital of the Kingdom of Russia when he passes through shortly before the invasion. The Mongols arrive in such numbers, according to the chronicles, that the sound of their horses and their wagons and their shouting is loud enough to prevent conversation inside the city. The city is besieged, reduced, destroyed. The friar Carpini, crossing through in 1245, describes innumerable skulls and bones lying in the plain. The city reduced to near nothingness, the few inhabitants living in temporary shelters amid the ruins. The armies continue west, so they cross the Carpathians. They enter Poland and Hungary simultaneously. Two separate columns, coordinated from thousands of miles away through the Yam network, striking both kingdoms at once so that neither can reinforce the other. At the Battle of Legnica, a Polish-German force under Henry the Pious is annihilated. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian army is destroyed. The advance guard of the Western Column reaches the Adriatic coast of Dalmatia. The Mongol Empire touches the edge of Western Europe. Then the news arrives from Karakorum. Ögedei Khan is dead. The Mongol princes must return for the cruelty. The empire requires a successor. The campaign is suspended. The armies withdraw. Whether Western Europe was saved by geography, by the defensive capabilities of its castles and its forests and its wet terrain, or whether it was saved by the coincidence of one man's death at a particular moment, is a question historians have debated for 8 centuries. The honest answer is that we cannot know because the campaign was never completed. What we can say is that at the moment Ögedei died, in December 1241, the Mongol armies were advancing, and there was nothing in the field between them and the Atlantic coast that had demonstrated the ability to stop them. Think about that. The specific mechanics of Mongol battle tactics deserve the detailed examination that they rarely receive in popular accounts, because the tactics are not simply riding and shooting. They are a sophisticated system of coordinated maneuver that requires extraordinary skill, training, and coordination to execute, and that, when executed against enemies who do not understand it, appears almost magical in its effectiveness. The basic Mongol tactical formation involves light cavalry, the actual horse archers, and heavy cavalry, the armored lancers who deliver the decisive blow once the light cavalry has created the conditions for it. The sequence is: the light cavalry approaches the enemy at the edge of effective archery range, looses arrows in volleys, and retreats when the enemy advances. The retreat is not flight. It is a controlled withdrawal that maintains a constant distance from the pursuing enemy, while continuing to loose arrows backward over the horse's hindquarters. The Mongol bow is a composite recurve bow, made from layers of wood and horn and sinew that give it a draw weight and range exceeding that of almost any other bow of the period. An archer on horseback, shooting backward at a gallop, can still deliver a lethal shot at range. The pursuing enemy is now disordered. It has advanced beyond its initial formation, its cavalry separated from its infantry, its cohesion disrupted by the pursuit, and it has advanced into the prepared engagement zone where the Mongol heavy cavalry is waiting. The heavy cavalry charges the disordered pursuing force with the full weight of armored horses and armored lancers. The result, repeatedly documented in the chronicles of campaigns from China to Poland, is the complete destruction of the pursuing force. This is the fake retreat, the tactic known in Mongolian as the Ögedei. It is not a trick, and in the sense of something executed once and then countered. It is a structural advantage, a tactic that requires the enemy to either advance in pursuit and be destroyed, or to hold its position and be ground down by the arrow volleys, and that presents these options in a way that makes the suicidal choice psychologically compelling. The pursuing army does not usually understand, in the moment of the pursuit, that it is being drawn into a trap. It sees an enemy retreating and does what armies do when they see an enemy retreat. It pursues. The commanders who figure out the tactic, who recognize that the Mongol retreat is tactical rather than genuine, still face the problem of how to respond to it, because simply standing still and absorbing arrow fire is also eventually fatal, and because the Mongol army will execute envelopment maneuvers against a static force, sending columns around the flanks to strike from multiple directions simultaneously. There is no easy answer to the Mongol tactical system within the frameworks of 13th century warfare. The effective responses that eventually emerge, fighting in terrain that horses cannot easily navigate, behind fortifications that the early Mongol army cannot reduce, in conditions that suppress archery, are responses that acknowledge the system's dominance in open-field combat and seek to avoid it. The integration of siege technology into this mobile tactical system is what makes the Mongol army under Ögedei qualitatively different from what it was under Genghis. Under Genghis, the siege capability exists but is developing. The campaigns in China and Central Asia forced the development of this capability, producing the Chinese and Persian engineers and the accumulated siege technology that Ögedei inherits. Under Ögedei, the siege capability is fully developed and fully integrated. A Mongol army on campaign carries its siege equipment and its siege specialists along with its cavalry, so that the transition from field battle to siege operations requires no pause, no waiting for specialist forces to arrive. The specific weapons of the Mongol siege train have been partially documented through both textual sources and archaeological finds, and the picture they present is of a sophisticated arsenal that draws on multiple military traditions. Trebuchets of the standard counterweight type, capable of throwing stones of several hundred pounds at city walls. Traction trebuchets, smaller but faster to aim, used for plunging fire into the interior of defended positions. Fire bombs, clay containers packed with naphtha and ignited material, producing the same incendiary effect as the napalm of a later era. Smoke bombs that could be used to provide cover for assault parties or to drive defenders from the walls. scaling ladders that required no advanced construction because the Mongols used captive labor to build them on site. The human element of the siege operations is as important as the technology. The Mongols routinely used captives and surrendered populations as forced labor and as human shields. An advancing Mongol siege force will be accompanied by prisoners, men, women, and children taken from the previous city or the surrounding countryside, who are driven forward in front of the Mongol advance to absorb any arrows or projectiles from the defenders. The defenders face the choice of killing their own people, or people who are clearly not combatants, in order to slow the Mongol advance. The practice is documented in the chronicles with a matter-of-fact quality that suggests it is standard practice rather than exceptional cruelty. It is standard practice. It is, like everything in the Mongol system, a tool deployed in service of the strategic objective, getting the army to the wall with minimum Mongol casualties, then reducing the wall with minimum Mongol casualties, then taking the city with minimum Mongol casualties. The captives are a resource, and their deaths in front of the Mongol advance are an operational cost. Not a Mongol cost, but a cost that has been externalized onto the enemy population. The YAM network's role in the siege operations is worth examining specifically because it is what allows the coordination that makes the simultaneous campaigns of Ögedei's reign possible. A commander conducting a siege in northern China can send a report of his progress to Karakorum and receive strategic guidance within days, not weeks or months, which is the timeline within which any previous empire's strategic communication operated. Ögedei can adjust resource allocations between fronts in near real time, redirect reinforcements based on current intelligence, issue modified objectives as the strategic situation evolves. This is the management of war at a scale that has no precedent before the invention of electronic communications. Ögedei is not present at any of the campaigns of his reign in the way that Genghis was present at his. He is in Karakorum, reading dispatches and issuing orders, and the Empire's military machine operates across a front of thousands of miles because the communication network connects it to the strategic direction in the center. The YAM stations are spaced every 25 to 40 miles, each maintaining a stock of fresh horses and provisions for the messengers who use them. The messengers are professional riders, selected for endurance and speed, equipped with official passes that give them priority access at every station, riding day and night in relays that can sustain the communication speed across continental distances. And a message from the Mongol advance in Poland, sent at maximum speed through the relay system, can reach Karakorum in approximately 2 weeks. This is, in the context of medieval communication, astonishing. The administrative side of this system, the record-keeping, the supply management, the maintenance of the station infrastructure, is handled by the conquered populations whose administrative skills the Mongols have pressed into service. Chinese bureaucrats manage the eastern portions of the network with the same systematic attention they would have given to any large-scale infrastructure project of the Jin dynasty. Persian scribes manage the Central Asian portions. The network functions because it is operated by people who know how to operate it, who have been trained in the administrative traditions of civilizations that built complex infrastructure. This is the final, essential element of the machine. It is staffed by the people it has destroyed. The administrative capability that makes the Mongol Empire function at continental scale is the administrative capability of the civilizations the empire has conquered, redirected from the management of those civilizations to the management of their own subjugation and the management of the further conquests that will subjugate others. It is, in a precise sense, a system that converts the competence of conquered peoples into the capacity to conquer more people. Ögedei builds this system deliberately. He recognizes that the Mongols cannot administer an empire of this scale with Mongol administrators. Because the Mongols do not have enough administrators, and because nomadic society has not produced the skills that sedentary administration requires. He solves this problem by using the skills he has conquered. The solution is elegant. The solution runs on the bodies of the people it uses. Ögedei Khan dies in December 1241, probably of the consequences of his drinking, probably in his mid-50s in Karakorum. He has been the great Khan for 12 years. In those 12 years, the empire he inherited has expanded to cover more territory than it covered at his father's death. An extraordinary achievement by any measure, made more extraordinary by the fact that Genghis Khan had already built the largest empire in history. Ögedei added to the largest empire in history and still made it bigger. The human cost of this achievement is not precisely calculable. The problem is not a lack of evidence. There is considerable evidence in the form of demographic surveys, archaeological records, and the chronicles of every civilization that was touched by the Mongol campaigns, about what the conquests produced. The problem is that the numbers available from this period are unreliable in specific and systematic ways. Medieval populations are estimated rather than counted. Medieval chronicles tend toward exaggeration in both directions, depending on the chronicler's relationship to the events and the mechanisms of death during the Mongol period. Massacre, famine consequent to agricultural disruption, even disease spreading through populations weakened and displaced by violence, are not easily separated from each other or from the background mortality of a world without modern medicine. What historians can say with confidence is this: the Mongol conquests of the 13th century represent one of the most significant demographic catastrophes in recorded human history, measured both in absolute numbers and as a proportion of the world population at the time. The commonly cited estimate, which appears in the work of historians who have spent careers trying to quantify the unquantifiable, is roughly 40 million deaths attributable to the Mongol conquests across the 13th and 14th centuries. This number encompasses the full sweep of Mongol expansion, from the campaigns of Genghis Khan through the Ilkhanate's destruction of Baghdad in 1258 and beyond, and is not attributable to Ögedei alone. But the campaigns of Ögedei's reign, the final destruction of the Jin in northern China, the reduction of the Khwarezmian successor states, the destruction of the Rus principalities, the invasion of Europe, represent perhaps the most concentrated period of killing within that larger total. The population of northern China under the Jin dynasty is estimated at roughly 60 million at the start of the Mongol campaigns in the early 13th century. By the mid-13th century, the same territory's population is estimated at perhaps 10 million. The gap represents a combination of direct killing, famine, disease, and disruption of the agricultural systems that sustained urban life. But the gap is real, and its magnitude is staggering. Northern Persia and Central Asia suffer comparable or even more complete demographic collapse in specific regions. The great cities of Khorasan, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, are the cities that most clearly document the Mongol capacity for total destruction. The chroniclers who write about the fate of Merv describe a figure of more than 1 million dead, a number that almost certainly exceeds the actual population of the city and its surrounding region, but that reflects a genuine catastrophe. A city of major significance reduced to ruins, its irrigation systems destroyed, the agricultural landscape around it so thoroughly disrupted that recovery takes generations. The Nishapur is documented through an unusual source. The Mongols apparently counted the skulls of the dead and stacked them in pyramids as a monument to the completeness of the destruction. The count they arrive at reproduced in Persian chronicles with a specificity that suggests it was based on an actual attempt to enumerate rather than a rhetorical exaggeration, is in the hundreds of thousands. The Pyramid of Skulls at Nishapur becomes one of the enduring images of the Mongol conquests, the image that later rulers invoke when they want to invoke the absolute maximum of destructive power. Tamerlane will build skull pyramids. He is invoking a specific tradition. The Rus principalities are an interesting case because the demographic and political consequences there are so visible and so well documented. Before the Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1240, the Rus world is a collection of competing principalities with a sophisticated urban culture, a literate clergy, a traditions of chronicle writing that leaves us excellent documentation of both the pre-invasion world and the catastrophe itself. After the invasion, the principalities survive, unlike the Jin dynasty, which is destroyed, but they survive as tributaries of the Golden Horde, paying annual tribute in money and in conscripts for the Mongol army, subject to devastating punitive raids whenever the tribute is late, or a principality attempts to assert independence. This condition of subjection lasts for more than 2 centuries. The period is remembered in Russian historical consciousness as the Tatar yoke, not a metaphor, but a lived political reality of 250 years of tribute payment, of Mongol overseers, of the periodic arrival of Mongol armies to punish non-compliance. The psychological and political effects of this long subjection on the development of Russian political culture have been debated by historians for centuries, with some arguing that the centralized, autocratic character of Russian political institutions owes something to the administrative model imposed by the Golden Horde, and others arguing that these features have different, more internal explanations. What is not disputed is the scale of the physical destruction. The Mongol invasion kills a significant proportion of the Rus population, estimates range from 1/3 to 1/2 of the total, and destroys the urban centers that had been the most economically and culturally developed parts of the Rus world. Kiev does not recover its pre-invasion population for several centuries. The shift in the center of political gravity from Kiev in the south to Moscow in the north, which defines the political geography of the next several centuries, is in significant part a consequence of the Mongol destruction of the southern cities. The memory of Ögedei and the traditions that have reasons to remember him reflects the specific position he occupies in the history of the conquests. Within the Mongol tradition itself, he is remembered relatively well, a wise ruler and administrator who gave the empire structure, like a man whose generosity was genuine and whose governance was competent. The secret history of the Mongols portrays him with a warmth that it does not extend to all of Genghis's successors. The portrait is not uncritical, the drinking is noted, the political struggles are acknowledged, but the overall assessment is positive. Outside the Mongol tradition, in the traditions of the peoples who were on the receiving end of the campaigns he authorized, the memory is different. In the Persian and Islamic traditions, the Mongol conquests are a civilizational trauma. The destruction of the world of the Abbasid Caliphate, the burning of the libraries of Baghdad, which happens under Hulagu after Ögedei's death, but which is continuous with the destruction that Ögedei's campaigns inaugurate, seem of the devastation of the agricultural and urban systems that sustained one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the medieval world. Ögedei is not the villain of this tradition. That role goes primarily to Genghis and then to Hulagu, but he is part of the machine that makes it possible. In the Chinese tradition, the memory is more complex still, because the Mongol dynasty that eventually rules China, the Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, Ögedei's nephew, is itself a Chinese dynasty in the sense that it governs China through Chinese administrative structures and that its rulers, including Kublai, make serious efforts to present themselves as legitimate heirs of the Chinese imperial tradition. This creates a peculiar situation in which the same dynasty that is responsible for the devastation of northern China becomes, over the course of decades, integrated into the Chinese imperial tradition and remembered with the same mixed assessment: capable rulers, foreign conquerors, destroyers of the old order, builders of a new one, that China extends to every dynasty that governs it. The fame asymmetry between Genghis Khan and Ögedei Khan is one of the more interesting features of the historical memory of the Mongol Empire. Genghis is one of the most famous people in human history. His name is immediately recognizable across most of the world. His image appears on currency. His legend has been the subject of films and novels and historical debates for 8 centuries. Ögedei is known primarily to specialists. The man who expanded the empire Genghis built, who gave it the administrative structure without which it would have fragmented within a generation, who authorized the campaigns that destroyed Kiev and came within a few hundred miles of the English Channel. This man is a footnote in popular historical consciousness. The asymmetry makes sense when you understand what fame requires. Fame requires a compelling personal narrative, preferably one with dramatic reversals and moments of individual heroism. Genghis Khan's rise from a kidnapped child on the step to the conqueror of the world is one of the most remarkable personal narratives in human history, and it is told repeatedly because it is genuinely extraordinary. Ögedei's narrative is the narrative of capable administration, of systems built and maintained, of logistics managed, and campaigns coordinated from a fixed point thousands of miles from the front. It is not a narrative that generates mythology. It generates successful outcomes. But successful outcomes at the scale of the Mongol Empire under Ögedei mean the destruction of entire civilizations. The successful outcome of the campaign in northern China means Kaifeng reduced to ruins, millions dead, an agricultural landscape so disrupted that it will not fully recover for generations. The successful outcome of the Rus campaign means Kiev as a field of bones. The successful outcome of the European campaign, interrupted by Ögedei's death, remains unknowable. We cannot say what would have happened if the armies that destroyed Kiev had been allowed to continue west for another year, or 5 years, or 10. But the trajectory was clear. The question that Ögedei's history poses is not the question of individual evil. He's not a convenient monster. He is a capable administrator who built systems that killed tens of millions of people, and who understood perfectly well what those systems were doing, and who deployed them with a pragmatic calm that is, in its own way, more disturbing than the passionate cruelty of a different kind of conqueror. The question is, where does responsibility lie in a system of this kind? If one man, Genghis Khan, builds the weapon, and another man, Ögedei Khan, industrializes the weapon and deploys it at continental scale, who is responsible for the bodies? The obvious answer is both. But the more interesting question is what the distribution of that responsibility reveals about the structure of power itself, about how large-scale violence is actually produced in the world. It is not produced primarily by monsters. It is produced primarily by systems. Therefore, by the cumulative effect of administrative decisions made by capable people who understand what their decisions will produce and make them anyway. Because the systems they serve reward the outcomes, and because the distance between the decision and the consequence is large enough that the consequence can be processed as an abstraction. Ögedei processes the death toll of his campaigns as an abstraction. The reports arrive in Karakorum, the numbers are noted, the campaigns are adjusted accordingly. Kaifeng falls. The next campaign is authorized. The system continues. This is not unique to Ögedei. It is not unique to the Mongols. It is the recurring structure of organized violence at scale in every era and every civilization. And the particular horror of the Mongol case is the scale. 40 million deaths is the largest concentration of organized human violence in the medieval period, and possibly in any period prior to the 20th century. And the speed with which the system was assembled from essentially nothing. 2 generations, 2 men, 1 nomadic confederation transformed into a machine that touched every civilization from China to Poland. The walls of Kaifeng have been dust for nearly 8 centuries. The canals that made it the world's greatest city have been plowed under by 8 centuries of agriculture and neglect. The million people who live there, the scholars and the merchants and the craftspeople and the children, have been absorbed into the aggregate statistics of a demographic catastrophe so large it barely fits in the mind. They were there. They built something extraordinary. They lived in it. And then the dispatch arrived in Karakorum, and Ögedei read it and authorized the next stage of the campaign. The system is always already running. The question is always, who is sitting at the desk? The long aftermath of the Mongol conquests resists the kind of clean narrative arc that history prefers, because it does not resolve into a simple story of either permanent destruction or eventual recovery. The world the Mongols made is a more complicated place than either of those endings. Northern China recovers, eventually, over the course of a century or more. The population of the territories that were under Jin dynasty control at the start of the Mongol campaigns does eventually return to something approaching its pre-conquest level. But it takes until the 15th century, or later, 2 centuries after the conquests, for the demographic hole to be substantially filled. The agricultural systems that were disrupted recover when the disruption ends and administration is restored. The canal systems are rebuilt. The examination system, which the Mongols initially suspend and then restore in modified form under later rulers, produces the administrators who manage the recovery. But the specific intellectual and cultural civilization of the Jin dynasty, the particular combination of Yurchen political culture and Chinese administrative tradition, or the literary and artistic production of that specific historical moment, the specific people who were doing the specific things they were doing, that does not recover because it cannot. You cannot recover the dead. You cannot reconstruct the specific creative moment of a civilization that was cut off before it ran its natural course. What emerges from the ashes is something different. The Yuan dynasty's China, then the Ming dynasty's China, both extraordinary civilizations in their own right, but not continuous with what was there before. Persia and Central Asia present a more ambiguous picture. The irrigation systems that sustained the agricultural civilizations of Khorasan and the Amu Darya Basin were among the most sophisticated in the medieval world, and in their destruction by the Mongol campaigns produced a demographic and ecological catastrophe that some historians have argued permanently reduced the carrying capacity of the region. The desert that now covers large portions of what was once agricultural land in Turkmenistan and eastern Iran reflects in part the failure to maintain irrigation infrastructure across the generations that followed the Mongol destruction. This is speculation that not all historians accept. The relationship between medieval military campaigns and modern landscape is too complex for confident attribution. What is not speculative is that the cities of Khorasan do not recover their pre-Mongol cultural and economic position. Nishapur is never again a center of world scholarship. Merv does not rebuild the intellectual flowering of the Eastern Islamic world, which had been producing work in mathematics and astronomy and philosophy and medicine that would eventually feed into the European Renaissance. is not extinguished entirely, but is permanently displaced. From Central Asia toward Cairo, toward Anatolia, toward the cities that were not destroyed. The Golden Horde's relationship to the Rus principalities produces, over 2.5 centuries, a set of political and cultural consequences whose exact nature has been debated by historians since at least the 18th century. The Tatar yoke is real. The tribute payments, the census conducted by Mongol administrators to assess the population for tax purposes, the periodic punitive expeditions when payments are late, and the requirement that Rus princes receive their authority through a patent granted by the Khan of the Golden Horde rather than through their own claims. The princes of Moscow, who eventually emerge as the dominant power within the Rus world, are princes who have learned, through generations of experience, how to manage their relationship with the Horde. When to pay, when to defer, when to use Horde authority against rival princes, and eventually when the Horde has weakened enough to challenge it. The political culture that emerges from this experience is shaped by it in ways that scholars continue to argue about. The centralized, autocratic character of the Muscovite state that eventually becomes Russia. The subordination of the aristocracy to the Tsar's will. Or the absence of the kind of representative institutions that develop in Western Europe during the same period, the particular relationship between the state and the church. These features of Russian political development have complex causes, and the Mongol period is one of them without being the only one or the simplest one. What is clear is that the Mongol period ends the political civilization of Kievan Rus as it existed before 1237. The princes who rebuild do not rebuild what was. They build something shaped by 2.5 centuries of existence as tributaries, and what they build produces the Russia of Ivan the Terrible and eventually the Russia of the Romanovs. A state of continental scale and autocratic character, different from both the Kievan civilization it follows and the European civilizations it borders. The near conquest of Europe is the part of Ögedei's legacy that carries the most sustained what-if quality, because the campaign was interrupted rather than concluded, and because the question of what would have happened if Ögedei had lived has no answer except speculation. The speculation that historians have engaged in is not frivolous. The Mongol army that destroyed Kiev and Krakow and broke the Hungarian army at Mohi was, by every military measure available, the most capable force in the world at that moment. Western Europe's defensive capabilities, the castles, the knights, the urban walls, had not stopped the Mongol advance anywhere it had been seriously applied. The terrain and the climate of Western Europe posed genuine challenges, particularly the forests and the winter weather, but the Mongol army had already demonstrated an ability to adapt to a wide range of terrain and climate conditions. What stopped the advance was Ögedei's death. The Mongol princes had to return for the succession council. The campaign was suspended. It was never resumed at the same scale. The political dynamics of the succession and then the internal conflicts between the various Mongol successor states consumed the energy that might have been directed westward. The lesson that medieval Europe drew from this near miss, to the extent it drew a lesson at all, was the wrong one. The lesson most European rulers and scholars drew was that the Mongols had retreated because they had found the West too difficult, or because God had intervened, or because the fortifications had been sufficient. And the actual lesson, that the most capable military force in the world had been stopped by the coincidence of its supreme commander's death, and that the structural factors that made it unstoppable had not been addressed, was not absorbed. Ögedei's own death is, in a final irony, the most consequential military event of his reign. He dies before the campaign he authorized has reached its conclusion, and the campaign ends with him. The man who industrialized conquest, who built the systems that made continental-scale military operations possible, whose administrative genius extended the reach of the Mongol war machine to distances that no previous empire had managed. This man dies in his tent of drink, and the system he built is thrown into uncertainty by the succession crisis his death produces. The system survives him. So the empire fragments eventually, but it fragments into successor states: the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan dynasty, the Chagatai Khanate, that are each themselves imperial powers of enormous scale and sophistication, each inheriting components of the administrative and military system that Ögedei built. The fragmentation is real, but it is the fragmentation of something very large into pieces that are still, by the standards of anything that came before the Mongol Empire, gigantic. The world that exists in 1241, when Ögedei dies, is permanently different from the world that existed in 1229, when he took power. The difference is measured in the demographic catastrophe of northern China, in the ruins of the Rus principalities, in the destroyed cities of Persia, or in the changes to trade routes and political geography that the Mongol conquests produce. The difference is also measured in the things that are still standing. The trade network that the Pax Mongolica eventually produces across the empire. The movement of technologies and diseases and peoples across the Eurasian landmass that the Mongol road system facilitates. The transmission of knowledge from one end of the continent to the other that happens because merchants and missionaries and diplomats can travel the length of Asia under Mongol protection. Plague travels too. The Black Death, which devastates Europe and much of Asia in the mid-14th century, is in significant part a product of the connectivity that the Mongol Empire creates. The rat populations and the human populations moving along the Silk Road, nor the trade networks that allow diseases to move as fast as goods. The Mongol Empire kills tens of millions in the 13th century, and then, through the ecological conditions it creates, probably kills tens of millions more in the 14th. This is not what Ögedei intended, but it is what the system he built produced, in the way that complex systems always produce consequences that extend beyond their designer's intentions and beyond their designer's lifetime. The system runs past the man. The man is always mortal. The system continues. What persists from Ögedei Khan in the end is not the specific decisions he made or the specific campaigns he authorized, though these are recoverable from the historical record in some detail. What persists is the demonstration that administrative competence applied to military power can produce effects that individual military genius cannot. That the capacity to coordinate multiple campaigns simultaneously, to maintain logistics across continental distances, to communicate at speeds that allow real-time strategic adjustment, that this capacity, in the hands of a ruler who understands it, is more dangerous than any weapon. The system he built was dismantled eventually through its own internal contradictions. The succession crisis that his death produces, the fragmentation of the empire into competing khanates, the gradual weakening of the Mongol military capacity through sedentarization and the loss of the steppe warrior culture that sustained it. All of this produces the eventual end of the Mongol moment in world history. But for 12 years, the most capable military and administrative system in the world was run by a man sitting in a tent in Mongolia, reading dispatches and issuing orders and drinking too much and keeping the whole thing moving. Think about what it means to hold that much of the world in your hands. Think about what it means to use it the way Ögedei used it. The dispatch arrives in Karakorum. The great Khan reads it. He issues his orders. Outside the walls of Kaifeng, the siege engines continue their work.